All right, so let's jump right into this deep dive today. We're looking at Trump's second transition back into the White House. And man, something tells me this is going to be fascinating. I mean, it's barely been like 3 weeks since the election, and he's practically got his whole cabinet ready to go already. It's crazy. We're working from this ABC News report from back then, so we're really going to see how all this went down.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable how different this transition was from his 2016 one. Back then, it was just all over the place, almost chaotic.
Yeah.
But this time around, it's like he's got it down to a science.
Yeah, no kidding. It's like night and day, right? Like in 2016, it took forever to get those positions filled, and this time it's just bam, 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 done.
Yeah.
Do you think this is just a matter of him having more experience the second time around? Like he knows the ropes better now?
Experience definitely plays a role. 4 years in the White House gives you a massive head start, just in terms of knowing who to pick and how to get them in place quickly. But it also might signal a change in his approach, like this speed and efficiency. It could be a sign that he's coming back with a really clear agenda, and he's determined to push it through fast.
Okay, so maybe this time around we're going to see a more focused, organized Trump presidency. Less reactive, more proactive.
It's certainly a possibility. And speaking of agendas, there's one name in his cabinet picks that really has people talking. Russ Vought, the new head of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB for short.
Okay, so the OMB, that's the budget office, right? But why is this particular appointment causing such a stir?
Well, think of the OMB like the gatekeeper of government spending. They decide which programs get funded and which ones don't. If Vought wants to, say, defund a climate change initiative, he can simply refuse to allocate money for it. That's the kind of power the OMB has. And Vought, he's not just some random budget guy. He was a key figure in developing this thing called Project 2025.
Project 2025. Okay, that rings a bell. Didn't Trump kind of try to distance himself from that during the campaign?
He did, which is what makes this appointment so interesting. Project 2025 is basically a blueprint for a complete overhaul of the federal government.
Okay, we're going to need to unpack that. What exactly does Project 2025 entail? What are they trying to overhaul?
Imagine a federal government with way fewer employees, drastically reduced regulations, and significantly more power in the hands of the president. That's the vision of Project 2025.
Whoa, that's a pretty radical shift. Give me a concrete example. How would Project 2025 change things, say, for the Department of Education?
So Project 2025 advocates for either significantly downsizing or completely eliminating the Department of Education. The goal is to shift control of education to the state and local levels. A pretty controversial idea.
That is controversial. So on one hand, you'd have less federal involvement in schools. But on the other hand, doesn't that risk creating huge disparities between different states, different school districts?
That's a major concern critics have raised. They argue that without federal oversight and funding, you could see a widening gap between wealthy and poor school districts.
Okay, so Project 2025 is essentially about shrinking the federal government's role and boosting presidential power. And Trump is putting someone who helped design this whole plan in charge of the budget.
Exactly. It's like handing the keys to the kingdom to someone who wants to completely redesign the castle. It's not just Vaughn. There are other cabinet picks with strong ties to Project 2025 as well. Tom Homan for border security, Brendan Carr for FCC chair, Stephen Miller as a senior advisor. They've all been involved with this project in one way or another.
So this is more than just a few isolated appointments. It seems like Trump is surrounding himself with people who share this vision of a radically different federal government. But hold on. If this Project 2025 is so central to his plan, why downplay it during the campaign?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was he just being strategic, waiting till after the election to push this more openly? Or has something changed? Maybe his stance on it. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely, and we'll do just that. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we need to understand exactly how this Project 2025 would work in practice. Because it's one thing to talk about shrinking the government or expanding presidential power, but what does that actually look like? What are the mechanisms, the specific changes they're proposing?
That's where things get really interesting and potentially a little scary. One of the key elements of Project 2025 is this concept called Schedule F, which would fundamentally change the way the federal workforce operates.
Schedule F. All right, you've piqued my curiosity. What is this Schedule F all about? Okay, so you're saying there's this thing called Schedule F, and it's a key part of this Project 2025. So what exactly does it do?
Well, imagine a scenario where, like, thousands of government employees, scientists, policy analysts, lawyers, even people who manage these big federal programs, imagine they could just be fired with no explanation. Not for incompetence or breaking the law, but simply because they're not seen as loyal enough to the president. That's what Schedule F would allow.
Hold on. So you're saying this would like strip away job security for huge chunks of the federal workforce. But isn't there a system in place to prevent that kind of thing?
Right. Right now, most federal employees are protected by what's called the civil service system. It's designed to, keep politics out of hiring and firing decisions. You have to have a valid reason to dismiss someone, and they have the right to appeal.
So it's about making sure the people working for the government are qualified and doing their jobs, not just playing political games.
Exactly. It's about ensuring a competent and impartial civil service. But Schedule F, this would allow the president to reclassify huge numbers of these protected positions as at-will employees, meaning they could be fired for any reason or no reason at all.
Wow, that sounds like it could really undermine the whole idea of a professional, nonpartisan civil service. Is there any historical precedent for something like this? Has any other president ever tried to do something similar?
There have been attempts to politicize the civil service in the past, but nothing on the scale of what Project 2025 is proposing. It's really unprecedented in modern American history.
So this is potentially huge. I mean, we're talking about a fundamental shift in the way the federal government operates. And it seems like a lot of this just boils down to power, like who has it, who controls it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It really gets to the heart of this whole debate surrounding Project 2025. It's about shifting the balance of power away from these career civil servants, many of whom have like deep expertise in their fields, and towards political appointees who may be more focused on just implementing the president's agenda.
And that raises all sorts of questions, like what happens to the quality of government services? If you start replacing experienced professionals with political loyalists, what happens to the independence of agencies that are supposed to be free from political interference? These are big questions, questions we need to be asking.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just like theoretical concerns. We can look at some specific examples to see how this might actually play out in the real world. Let's take the Environmental Protection Agency, for example. The EPA.
Okay, the EPA. They're the ones responsible for protecting the environment, making sure our air and water are clean, right?
Exactly. And under Project 2025, the EPA would likely face massive budget cuts and staffing reductions. Many of its scientists and enforcement officials could be replaced with people who are more sympathetic to industry interests.
So potentially less environmental protection, weaker enforcement of regulations. That's a pretty significant shift.
It is, and it raises concerns about whether the EPA, under this new structure, would even be able to effectively carry out its mission of safeguarding public health and the environment.
It seems like a pattern is emerging here. Less regulation, more power concentrated in the executive branch, and a potential weakening of agencies that are supposed to be like watchdogs and protectors of the public interest. Is that a fair assessment of Project 2025?
I think that's a very astute observation. And it's not just the EPA. We could see similar shifts in agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Any agency that's tasked with, regulating industry or protecting consumers could be significantly impacted.
So we're not just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about potential changes that could impact the food we eat, the medicines we take, the safety of our workplaces, the security of our financial system, things that touch the lives of everyday Americans in very real ways.
You're exactly right. And that's why it's so important to understand what Project 2025 is, what it's proposing, and what the potential consequences could be. Because this isn't just some political game in Washington. It's about the kind of country we want to live in, the kind of future we want to create.
Well said. And speaking of the future, we need to talk about what all of this means for the average American, because it's easy to get lost in the weeds of policy and politics. But ultimately, this is about people's lives.
Absolutely. And the potential impacts of Project 2025 are far-reaching. We're talking about potential changes to healthcare, education, environmental protection, worker safety, consumer rights. The list goes on and on.
Okay, so let's break that down. We talked a bit about education earlier, but let's get into the specifics. If Project 2025 is implemented, what might that mean for students, teachers, and parents across the country? So we're talking about Project 2025 and what it could mean for, everyday Americans. We've touched on education a bit, but let's get specific. What could this mean for students, teachers, and parents if it's actually put into action?
Well, we already talked about how Project 2025 wants to shrink or even eliminate the Department of Education. And that would mean a huge shift in responsibility and funding. More control going to states and local communities.
Right, and what could that look like on the ground, like in a real classroom?
Imagine a scenario where federal funding, For things like special education programs or free school lunches, imagine that's drastically reduced or even disappears completely. That burden then falls on states and local school districts. Some districts, especially wealthier ones, they might be able to make up the difference. But many others could struggle, leading to things like larger class sizes, fewer resources, potentially even cuts to programs.
That sounds like it could make those inequalities in the education system even worse. I mean, we already see such a difference in resources between schools in wealthy areas and schools in less affluent communities.
Exactly, and that's a major concern for critics of Project 2025. They argue that this shift in funding responsibility could just widen the achievement gap between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds.
And what about teachers? How could Project 2025 impact their jobs and working conditions?
That's another area where there's a lot of uncertainty. With less federal oversight, there could be more variation in things like teacher certification requirements, salaries, benefits from state to state. Some teachers might find themselves with less job security or fewer professional development opportunities.
So potentially a less stable and less attractive profession overall. That doesn't sound good for attracting and retaining good teachers.
It's definitely something to consider. The impacts on the teaching profession are complex and could vary a lot depending on how states and local districts implement these changes.
Okay, so education is one big piece of the puzzle here, but we can't forget about healthcare. Project 2025 proposes some pretty big changes there as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. A cornerstone of Project 2025 is scaling back the federal government's role in healthcare. This includes things like repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, reducing funding for Medicaid, and giving states more flexibility in how they manage their healthcare systems.
Okay, and the Affordable Care Act, that's Obamacare, right? The one that expanded health insurance coverage to a lot of Americans.
That's right. And repealing it has been a goal for a lot of conservatives for a long time. They argue that it's too expensive, too bureaucratic, and gives the federal government too much control over healthcare.
But wouldn't repealing it mean that millions of people could lose their health insurance?
Yeah, that's a major concern for critics of Project 2025. They argue that repealing the Affordable Care Act without a good replacement plan could leave millions of Americans, especially those with pre-existing conditions, without access to affordable health care.
So this isn't just some theoretical policy debate. We're talking about people's lives, their ability to see a doctor when they need to.
Exactly. And that's why the healthcare aspects of Project 2025 are so controversial. There's a lot at stake for a lot of people.
It's clear that Project 2025 could really impact the lives of everyday Americans, from education to healthcare, from the environment to the economy. The potential changes are vast and far-reaching. So what can our listeners do? How can they get involved and make their voices heard and ensure their interests are represented in this whole debate?
Well, the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. Read about Project 2025, understand what it could mean, and talk to your elected officials about your concerns. Get involved with local advocacy groups or organizations, ones that are working on the issues you care about. The future of our country is being shaped right now, and every voice matters.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And the more we understand about what's at stake, the better equipped we are to participate in this conversation. We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We need to make our voices heard and hold our leaders accountable. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Project 2025. It's a complex and challenging topic, but it's one that deserves our full attention. Remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking questions of cool